and theological perspective, and I'll get into obviously what that means. But you'll forgive me if I start at the same place as I started on that first night, talking about snow, because I think it frames what we're talking about tonight, and that is, um, it. I you mentioned Appalachia. I live on the edge of the foothills of the Smokies in East Tennessee, and so we're kind of at that place where we don't get a lot of snow, and I'm learning what winter means in East Tennessee, and it really doesn't start till January, is one thing I learned. And there's usually about one good snow. So we got that a couple weeks ago. It was about 7 inches, and some ice, which is always fun. But I love snow. So I'm a Midwesterner at heart. I miss the cold winters. I know that might sound crazy, or maybe that makes sense to you, but miss the cold and snowy winters. Um, and so I just love the snow. Like it reawakens my inner child. And we're talking about enchantment. It brings that sense of a little bit of magic and mystery. And but also, one of the reasons I love the snow is that it reveals something that's hidden most of the time, and that is the tracks of the footprints of of human beings walking around. Actually, it's funny. My neighbor. This is a longer story, but my neighbor and I have built a friendship, and he's moving away, and he gave me his mower. Uh, but the mower's tires are flat and the battery's dead. So we had to drag it through 7 inches of snow together. And so you see the drag marks in the snow from his backyard to our garage. And but that's a tracing of neighborliness to me. And so footprints, the drag marks, the all the critters, I love the little bird footsteps are just lightly on the snow, and on maybe pets or dogs running around. So it shows that what normally we kind of see as something that's empty and barren and boring, that there's actually a lot of life, that there's actually the crossroads and the pathways of life. And I think when we talk about enchantment, the sense of looking at our rural places with the similar gaze, like with that same eye for to the untrained eye, it might look like it's a barren, boring, empty place, but it's actually there's a lot more going on than people realize, and sometimes that we realize, and that there's footsteps and evidence of life and the movement of spirit in all kinds of different ways. And so that's what we'll talk about today. Go ahead and share my screen. I love this quote from St. Hilary: everything that seems empty is full of the angels of God. And one of the, I subtitled this spiritual leadership in the middle of nowhere, because one of the things that I've tried to make a practice of my own and encourage others to try it out as well is anytime somebody says that you live in the middle of nowhere, or this place is out in the middle of nowhere, to translate that in your mind as the middle of now here. That the middle of nowhere just might be the now here of where God is present and active, and where there's life and love. And even when we forget what's there, um, it's a little reminder for me of learning to see the divine presence in places where we don't always expect it. And so that's what, when I say enchantment, that's really what I mean, is learning to see our people and our place as the now and here of God's presence, God's process and God's purposes. I guess that was, I forgot to take that out. I guess it's a plug for my book. So tonight, as much as we have time for, I'm going to talk about re-enchanting in two different arenas. It was supposed to be three, but as I prepared, there was definitely not enough time for that. And so we'll talk about re-enchanting the rural landscape and also re-enchanting through our language. So first, re-enchanting our landscapes. How do we teach and preach in such a way that reveals our reveals those footsteps as that we are in the center of divine presence, process, and purposes? And a quote that I often return to that I resonate a lot with is from the Hoosier Quaker, Scott Russell Sanders. And he says, "For all my convictions, I still have to wrestle with the fear in myself, my child, and in some of my neighbors that our place is too remote from the action. I deal with my own unease by asking just what action I am remote from: a stock market, a debating chamber, a drive in mortuary. The action that matters, the work of nature and community, goes on everywhere." The action that matters, the work of nature and community, goes on everywhere. It's kind of a good mantra, I think, to have that I've had to return to is both that idea of we're in the middle of the now here of God's presence, but also that the action that matters goes on everywhere. So despite what it may feel like sometimes, or despite how it might be portrayed in popular media, what we're doing matters. Our work matters. Even if it's not the big and the bold initiatives in business and politics and nonprofits. Don't underestimate doing those small things with great love. So this was just a list I came up with in like 5 minutes of things, actions that matter that we often maybe think would just be small things. Growing a garden, loving your neighbor, visiting the imprisoned, raising a family, playing with children, praying for the suffering, showing up to a birthday party, throwing a baby shower, talking with friends on the porch, serving on the village council, volunteering at the food bank, supporting a local business, caring for a dying loved one, teaching students at a local school. Now, this list is of actions that I think we all just see the significance at some level, but especially when we're facing like the enormity of what many of us feel like when we look at what's going on in our country. It feels like we're not doing enough, that we can't make a difference. And I think the more direct action, activism and advocacy, that matters as well. It's very important. But I also just want to help folks reframe like the small actions too are a part of that, um, chipping away at the chaos and the division and nurturing neighborliness and love and justice in local places. So it's funny, actually, a couple examples of that I've experienced is that last night I was working on this presentation. I was working on the actions that matters idea, and I'm like annoyed that I have to put it down so that I can go to this birthday party, that one of a girl from our meeting was turning 10 and had a birthday party, and it's like, oh, I gotta, interrupt my work and go over here and do this. And it struck me, in one of those moments where you kind of laugh and also like, yeah, I get it. I see the light here in that's an action that matters. Showing up for this girl maybe was not like earth shattering, but it mattered a lot to her, and it mattered a lot to her family, who's struggling, is going through a lot right now. Showing up, singing happy birthday, eating the snacks, laughing, giving a gift, all of those things were part of the action that matters. The other thing that came to mind was there's a there's a guy in our meeting who's kind of more of a manly man type of guy, and works with his hands, fixes stuff, carries concealed carry handgun all the time. And so, you kind of have the stereotype of, oh, I know who that is and what he's like. But he's also happens to be one of the biggest advocates for LGBTQ folks that I know. And uh, we would, Ashlyn and I will often go over and visit with him and his wife. And one of the things I find really endearing about those visits is that they always will say, Jeff, his name is Jeff, he'll always say, when we leave, now it could be 4 in the afternoon or 1 o'clock in the morning, he'll say, now don't run off now. Don't run off now. And I just really I find that endearing. But one evening we were getting ready to leave and he comes and he sets down a glass of whiskey beside me. And he's a big whiskey drinker, has a whole big bar of different whiskeys that he's collected and stuff. And I'm not really a big whiskey drinker, but he set that down beside me. And I realized what that meant. It wasn't a pressure to drink alcohol. It wasn't um, a test. It was what you might have heard of the Gottmans, the psychologists. They talk about a bid for connection. And him setting this cup beside me, this glass, was a bid for connection. And answering that bid and sipping that whiskey and talking with him he opened up about some things. And I was glad that I answered that invitation. And that was an action that mattered. Sitting down, talking, having a longer conversation with somebody you care about. You may have heard the saying from Zen Buddhism: before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. So it's not that we never get like too enlightened or too progressive or too spiritual for those basic tasks of ordinary life and caring for our family and our neighbors. We just learn to do them with more intention and integrity and love and prayerfulness. I also thought of there's a story about Thomas Merton tells a story in his book on spiritual direction about a Russian spiritual guide who met with this woman for many years, and she was always talking about her turkeys. She raised turkeys, and people got critical that the spiritual guide would just sit there and talk about her turkeys with her. And they said, "Don't you think it's a little beneath you to be, always talking about turkeys?" And he said, "Not at all. Her whole life is in those turkeys." Just that sense of the spirituality of ordinary life and rural life, and that not being inferior, but that being part of the work that matters. I think a lot of people have a lot of people in rural settings need that reminder that your work matters, your love is not wasted. You do make a difference. It's not meaningless to the heart of God or worthless to the hands of God. And also that you're not missing out. A couple of years ago, I wrote this short poem after I'd missed watching the Oscars, but had this lovely creature sighting on the back road near our house. I said, I don't know who won an Oscar. Didn't catch it last night. But I did witness 32 wild turkeys crossing a country road with equal parts elegance and clumsiness. Then a peacock passed by. I'm not missing out.
Mm.
And no hate on people who like the Oscars. It was just that sense of I missed the pomp and circumstance of this thing happening on TV, but I didn't miss this beautiful sacred thing that was happening in my own backyard. And I have no idea the story with the peacock, why there was a peacock, but I've seen it a couple other times too. But I call it JOMO, joy of missing out, and I think that's a reframing sometimes we need to take, especially in a rural setting, because it can feel like you're away from the action, um, but you're not missing out on some really sacred and special things happening in your own backyard. So there's a saying in I've heard it attributed to a lot of people, Greek or Celtic Christian traditions, that say God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Kind of some wild geometry or something with that one, but I love that reminder that the center is everywhere, that we're not on this side, we're not on the edge of where God is present and active. We are one center of where we can find God. Thomas Merton put it this way: the gate of heaven is everywhere. Or like Jacob from the Hebrew Bible, we wake up and say, surely the Lord was in this place and I was not aware of it. I think re-enchanting the rural landscape means learning to see that presence and awakening to that and helping our people also awaken to that sense of presence and process and purpose around us in the landscape. In Quakerism, we have the theology of the sacramental universe. And for me, anyway, what that means is not so much being against the traditional historical sacraments as much as saying that's too limiting, that there's sacraments everywhere, that the saying goes that the sacraments are not two, as in the Protestants, or seven, as for the Catholics, but 70 times seven. Sacraments are everywhere, and the center is everywhere. And so that's an invitation. And an everlasting bolo, be on the lookout for God who is always and everywhere present, even and especially where we least expect it. It's kind of my definition of that omnipresence theology. Another concept with this is between the porch and the altar. So a few years ago, just when I was really starting to grow a concern for rural ministry and small towns, I a guy who was a teacher when I was a kid, he said he was starting this ministry called Small Town Intercessors. And I was really intrigued by the idea because I do want to, help folks in rural places realize like we're not far from God. God is just as close to us, and our prayers really can make a difference. And so I wasn't able to go in person, but they had a live stream, and they set up in a town square, small town in Ohio, and he talked about this passage from the prophet Joel about the priest who stood between the porch and the altar of the temple. Well, he then proceeded to talk about intercession for a list of these far right wing causes and politicians. And for him, that's what it meant to be a small town intercessor. And so I kind of lost some interest in that endeavor, but I actually kept thinking about that phrase between the porch and the altar. And I have like it's one of those things I've got a book outline for it, but you have to actually have to write those things. Um, but thinking about prayer happening in all those spaces between the porch and the altar. So the porch, the backyard, the um, country road, the town square, the bedside, the kitchen, and even the altar. Maybe even, who knows, sometimes God even shows up in our meeting houses, our churches. And this more expansive sense of what it means to pray in a rural place. And I do believe that there's power in being a small town intercessor, so to speak. Like I really believe that um, I'm an open and relational theologian. I believe God is relational and the future is open. And so our prayers really do impact and influence God and the unfolding of events. Okay, so some words about teaching and preaching from the Bible in a way that is re-enchanting our landscapes. I don't know if you've ever heard of Vale Palmer. He's a friend that was, I believe he's deceased now, but he was in the Northwest, and I met him a couple times. And he wrote a book called Face to Face, and he talks about Quakers' relationship with the Bible, and he uses the language of an empathic reading of the Bible. That Quakers saw themselves as relating to the same living God and saw themselves in the experiences and stories of the Bible. That, in a sense, Quakers believe that we're always living in biblical times, and we're always living in biblical places. That while there's some risk in projecting ourselves onto the characters of the Bible and the stories of the Bible, there's also a lot of power in reconnecting what the biblical landscapes and characters with rural landscapes and characters. And I think that can really be empowering and enchanting. So I'm just going to offer a few resources with that. Um, One is a book called Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, an agrarian reading of the Bible. It's a really great book. Talks about, it's primarily the Hebrew Bible. So it talks about Genesis, talks about the Psalms, even Song of Songs, the prophets, Leviticus. Really helpful in seeing that there's a lot of connections. I mean, the Bible is full of stories of people, rural places, rural people encountering God in rural places. So it helps make those connections. And then more for Jesus, this book, Jesus for Farmers and Fishers, Justice for All Those Marginalized by Our Food System, is a really good book as well that talks about the ministry of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and how that connect. We tend to read those spiritually, which is obviously part of the meaning, but they were like were real struggles of real people trying to make a living as farmers and fishers. And what does that have to say to us today? And the other one is by a guy named Brad Roth. He's written a couple others too, and he's a Mennonite pastor in Kansas, and he wrote this book called Flyover Church, and it's based more in the Gospel of Mark and pointing out the connections between the rural places and stories from that gospel and what that can say to us and people who don't live in rural places. And then if you want to go expanding a little bit beyond just the human characters, there's a great book called Mouth of the Donkey, reimagining biblical animals that I think is helpful in thinking about all God's critters and their place in the choir. And then Randy Woodley is a guy that I know who he lives in Northwest as well, writing from an indigenous perspective. He wrote a book called Shalom in the Community of Creation, and he talks about the indigenous vision of the harmony way and the connections with the biblical vision of shalom or peace and flourishing, and how that also, I think, a big part of it for me was learning to relate in a different way to the rest of the community of creation, the elements and the other animals, fellow creatures. So, three practices that you might want to try with this, and I'll send out this PowerPoint because I don't think we're gonna have time to like actually do them tonight. List out some actions that matter, that are maybe not always, that sometimes are undervalued, and even just take 5 minutes and just make a list. Um, Name 3 to 5 places where prayer happens between the porch and the altar, those ordinary spaces of your life and landscape, and discuss with a friend where are the connections between the biblical landscapes and the landscapes of our region. So I'm going to pause there for any questions or wisdom sharing about that. If anybody has, I'll stop sharing for a second. If anybody has any questions